Nobody in that arena that night was thinking about Whitney Houston. That's the honest truth of it. It was November 1983, somewhere between Chicago and Detroit, on a tour that had sold out arenas before the ink was dry on the tickets. The crowd filing into their seats that night had one name on their minds, and it was not hers. They were there for Luther Vandross, and in 1983 that meant something. Luther was not just popular, he was the kind of artist the industry pointed to when they needed to explain what it meant to do everything right. Never Too Much had become one of those songs that lived in people, not just in their speakers. His voice was warm, controlled, devastating in the best possible way. Every note landed exactly where Luther wanted it to land. The music critics loved him. The radio programmers loved him. He was, in every measurable sense, the real thing. And then there was the opening act. 20 years old, no album, no chart history. A girl from Newark, New Jersey, who had grown up singing in her mother's church and spent the last couple of years as a background vocalist, a demo singer, someone whose name appeared on liner notes that nobody read. The album was still being made. The strategy was still being figured out. For now, she was in this hallway, backstage, waiting. Harold Sims found her about 40 minutes before showtime. He was the tour's production manager, a man who had been doing this job long enough to have seen every variation of the opening act situation, and he handled it the way he always handled it, efficiently and without sentiment. 40 minutes, he told her. Maybe 45 if things were running a little behind. You finish, you clear the stage, and you make sure the crew has enough time to reset for Luther. He didn't say it unkindly. He just said it the way you state a logistical fact. Whitney nodded. She thanked him. And when he walked away, she looked down at her hands and noticed they were trembling slightly. Not from fear exactly, from something harder to name than fear. If this story connects with you, subscribe and stick around. There is a lot more where this came from. She had been here before, in a way. Not this specific hallway, not this specific arena, but in this specific feeling. The feeling of being somewhere you are not quite supposed to be yet, surrounded by people who have not yet decided whether to take you seriously. It started in Newark. It always started there, really. Sissy Houston had one of the most respected voices in gospel music, and she made sure her daughter understood from an early age what a voice was for. Not for entertainment, not for applause, though those things would come. A voice was a gift that came with a responsibility attached. You used it honestly, or you didn't use it at all. Whitney grew up in that tradition, in that church with that understanding buried deep in her. But the music industry had a different set of instructions. By the time Clive Davis came fully into her life, the conversation had shifted. You have something extraordinary, he told her, and he meant it. But extraordinary needed packaging. The gospel rawness, the church feeling, the undisciplined emotionality that made Whitney's voice do things, technically trained, singers couldn't replicate. All of that needed to be managed, delivered in a form that the market could absorb without being overwhelmed. Pull back a little on the runs, someone told her in a studio session that summer. You're over-singing. Let the song breathe. Whitney had nodded and tried to do what they asked. But every time she pulled back, something went missing. She could hear it herself. That particular quality living in the space between control and abandon. The thing that made her voice feel true rather than merely impressive. The industry wanted impressive. Whitney had always been after true. Standing in that hallway in Chicago, that tension was sitting right there with her. It had been following her for months. The arena was maybe 2/3 full when she walked out. The other third was still finding seats, still at the concession stands, still drifting in from the parking lot. The house lights were up. People were talking. A few turned to look at the stage out of mild curiosity, then turned back to their conversations. This was the opening act. This was the part of the evening you endured before the part you had actually paid for began. Harold Sims watched from the side of the stage with his arms crossed and his clipboard in one hand. He had nothing against this girl. She seemed professional, showed up on time, didn't give him logistical headaches. That was more than he could say for some acts he'd worked with. He checked his watch. Then he looked back at the stage. The band played the intro. Whitney stepped to the microphone. and then she stopped thinking about what they wanted from her. That was the thing nobody could have planned for, the thing no studio note or label strategy could manufacture or prevent. The moment Whitney Houston stopped managing herself and just sang, something happened in the room that didn't have a reasonable explanation. It wasn't a single note that did it. It was more like the room suddenly becoming aware that something was different about the sound, something unfiltered, something that bypassed the usual distance between performer and audience and arrived somewhere more direct. The people closest to the stage felt it first. A few conversations trailed off. A few heads turned. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in that gradual, involuntary way that happens when something real enters a space that has been full of the ordinary. As the set built and Whitney moved deeper into the music, the thing spreading through that arena wasn't excitement in the conventional sense. It was closer to recognition, like the audience was being reminded of something they had forgotten about music. That at its best, it wasn't a product or a carefully engineered emotional simulation. It was one human being telling the truth to a room full of other human beings, and the room recognizing that truth whether they wanted to or not. Harold Sims had stopped looking at his clipboard. James Calloway, Luther's musical director, a man who had spent his professional life in rooms full of exceptional singers, had moved from where he'd been standing to somewhere he could see the stage more clearly. He wasn't entirely sure when he'd done it. He just found himself there, watching. Whitney had been building towards something all set long, and the audience could feel it even if they couldn't name it. Then she let go of the microphone stand, took a half step back, nodded once to the band. They dropped out, one by one, until the arena was carrying almost nothing but air. And then she sang. No production underneath her, no buffer between her voice and the room. Just her, in that enormous space, climbing somewhere that voices aren't supposed to go without a net beneath them. The silence that fell in that arena was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of people collectively holding their breath. The kind of silence that only happens when a room full of strangers all have the same involuntary physical reaction at the same moment. When the last note finally dissolved, there was a full half second where nothing moved, where the arena just sat with what it had heard. Then it came down like a building. The noise was not polite. It was not the generous applause you give an opening act as a courtesy, the kind that says we acknowledge you were here. This was the kind of noise that says something just happened to us, and we are not entirely sure what. Sustained and genuine and louder than anyone backstage had anticipated. Harold Sims stood very still at the side of the stage. He was a practical man. He dealt in schedules and logistics and the unglamorous reality of keeping large touring productions running on time. But he had been in this business long enough to know the difference between a crowd that was applauding and a crowd that had genuinely been changed by something. Standing there in the quiet that had replaced his own internal calculations, he understood which one he had just witnessed. His silence said everything his words couldn't have. Luther Vandross walked out to that audience 20 minutes later. Immaculate, controlled, masterful. He did what he always did, which was fill the room with artistry that made people feel they were in the presence of something genuinely rare. The crowd gave him what they had come to give, but there was something different about the room itself. A room that has already peaked is a very specific kind of challenge, and Luther, whose instincts were as sharp as anyone in the business, felt it the moment he stepped into the lights. The tour moved on, Chicago to Detroit to Atlanta, and the cities after those. Whitney finished her set every night, cleared the stage on schedule, and let the headline act take over. She did her job exactly as she'd been hired to do it. But something had shifted in how the crew talked about her, in how audiences arrived earlier on the nights she was on the bill, in the increasingly thoughtful silences of the production staff watching from the wings. 18 months later, the debut album finally came out. And it came out the way albums almost never do, which is to say it arrived like something that had been waiting to happen. Saving All My Love for You went to #1 and stayed. Then How Will I Know? Then Greatest Love of All, which moved out of the category of hit song entirely and into something closer to a cultural event. 7 singles released, 7 #1s, a Grammy, then another, then several more after that. The arenas that had once been organized around Luther Vandross's schedule were now organized around hers. The opening act had become the headliner. The girl with the trembling hands and the gospel voice that nobody quite knew how to package had become something the industry hadn't encountered before. A singer so completely herself that the packaging almost stopped mattering. Harold Sims, years later, described the night in Chicago simply. He said he remembered watching her finish and going very quiet. The way you go quiet when you understand that what you just saw is not going to stay where you put it. He said he couldn't remember the exact moment he stopped checking his watch, but that by the time she was done, he had completely forgotten he was holding one. That is the particular thing about a voice like hers. It doesn't ask for your attention. It simply makes paying attention to anything else feel temporarily impossible. What Whitney Houston did on that stage in Chicago in 1983 was not complicated. She walked out in front of an indifferent audience that was there for someone else, and she sang like she was singing for her life. Not for survival, but for truth. She sang the way Newark had taught her, the way the church had taught her, without apology and without the managed restraint the industry kept asking her to perform. There is a specific kind of courage in that, in showing up fully in a room that has not decided whether you deserve to be there, in refusing to make yourself smaller so the space feels less threatened, in trusting that the truest version of what you carry is enough, not because anyone has told you so, but because you have decided it is, and you are willing to stand on that decision in front of thousands of people who came for someone else entirely. Whitney Houston stood on that decision her entire career. Some nights it cost her, some nights it saved her. That night in Chicago, it turned a room full of strangers waiting for someone else into a room that would not stop making noise for a very long time. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations, only to silence them with your true gift? Tell us your story in the comments below.